Welcome to the Church Planters Experience. If you find value in these conversations, please share them with others.
Welcome to Boston.
Thank you. It's interesting to see where you work out of, and
Right.
so the first thing we're going to have to talk about is the orange.
It's my company. I used to wear very, very plain clothes, and when we started our company, we started with orange as kind of our logo, and it kind of became a part of my personality then. So now I've actually I've started wearing other colors besides orange shirts lately, and it weirds people out.
It does, because children were like, when we're talking about the ordination, and they were looking, and they were like, well, that's the guy in the orange shirt, but he's not wearing an orange shirt.
It works as a branding device. People know me by orange. So
you just go for orange, and
yeah, I like it too. I don't know why. It just struck my fancy, and so
no, I mean it's pretty color.
Yeah, it's not super typical, and I like being a little bit off of the center, so it happens to work.
And so you do handyman service here.
My sons work for me. We started our company probably a year or two after we moved here. The first year I lived here, we came here in 2013, and there was three of us. It was Finney and I, and another brother by the name of Seth Corsica, who is from Massachusetts. He left after the first year, and then Jeremy Horning, who is now in Kampala, Uganda, with Followers of the Way there, was here, and so there were three of us. And Jeremy grew up in a cabinet shop and was kind of a framer and shed builder, and I am from the interior finish trades, painting and sheetrock. And so between the two of us, it was a pretty good mix.
Yeah.
So we started Alpha Omega Property Services then, and we developed a line of sheds that we were selling, urban sheds. They were kind of custom built and on site instead of kit builds. And both of those wings of our business grew, and Jeremy took the sheds, and I kept the handyman business. And now Urban Sheds is its own business and employs quite a few people. A few brothers here work for him. I think there's somebody in State College that works for him, isn't there? Is there somebody that works for Jeremy in State College? Urban
Not
Sheds
that
builder?
I know of, but
I could be wrong. And then I just work with my boys now. So my three older sons are kind of my work crew.
okay.
And I run the business from here. My oldest is 22, 19, and almost 18.
And they are the groundmen for your handyman. So when you talk about handyman, are you hanging blinds? Are you?
Yeah. We do a lot of time and material work that's just, some Boston professional doesn't want to hang shelves or put up blinds or whatever, and they hire us by the hour, time and material to do that. We also do some larger projects. Right now we're replacing soffits and fascia on a house, and we'll do a porch rehab or something like that. But typically we fit in a little niche where we're kind of short end work. The things that would be hard to call a contractor to have do at your house.
So do you do plumbing or?
We don't do plumbing. We don't do electrical.
Okay. So you're all just no plumbing, no electrical,
Right.
all trim or
trim,
exterior.
tile, flooring repair, pressure washing, deck staining.
Wow.
All kinds of stuff.
And you stay busy with that.
Yeah. We get a little slow in the winter, but
Yeah, everybody does.
yeah.
That's interesting because one of the things that I think is often difficult for people is when you move to a new area, what are you going to do?
Right.
And most of us end up going to some type of construction because it's just what we know.
Right.
And there's also a big demand for it.
Yeah.
For most people.
Yeah. It was one of the concerns that I had when I moved here. When Finney and I first started talking about coming to Boston, one of my main concerns was economic. For good reason. I lived very economically in Oregon. I lived in a very rural area, not very, but a rural area. Our rent was cheap. We had a big garden. It was not hard for us to live very economically there. And Boston, well, I just saw a report on Zillow. Zillow just ranked Boston as the most expensive average rent in the country. We just beat New York City by $6 this year. And the year I moved here in 2013, this was the 16th most expensive city in the world to live in. So Tokyo, Singapore, New York City, all those places, we were number 16. So economics are a real concern. There is a push and a pull with that issue, though, because the kind of rates that I would charge in rural Oregon for the work that we do are at least a half, if not a third, of what we charge here. And so while living expenses are much, much more here, we also charge a much higher billable rate than we would in some other places.
Right.
So there is some compensation. It is worth something having access to these markets.
And you're right in the middle of it.
And we're in the middle of it. And so we live north of Boston. You would have driven through Boston to get up here. So we're kind of like the north of the city. And I rarely go into the city for work. There's millions of houses in this area. There's no reason to go down to the city and mess with all that for work. So I very rarely do it.
Most of your work is in Medford.
Medford, and all these suburb towns like up here north of Boston.
Wow.
Somerville, Cambridge, Winchester, Arlington, Medford, Malden.
So if you were living in Oregon very economically and chose to move to Boston, where you're looking at the 16th highest when you moved here, rent rate in the world.
Right.
How did you make that?
Yeah,
that's a leap.
Yeah. So there's a whole story behind that. I had gotten involved. I had become interested in Christian communitarianism long before I moved to Boston. I had a very good friend of mine when we started our first church in Oregon in 2001. I think it was 2001. It was 2001, I think. And we all lived in this little rural town about 20 miles north of Eugene, Oregon. I had come from Eugene. My wife was from Salem and to the north, so we were kind of in between those two areas. And we were all, there was just a few of us that started that church, and all of us were poor, and all of us had bump little children, and I mean it was a very humble beginning. We were kind of street preachers, radical evangelists, and because I think probably for all of us, we had kind of been ostracized from our families for our radicalness, to one degree or another for most of us. We were kind of on our own, and we were all each other had, just the few of us. And so we lived very much like family. Like we lived across the railroad tracks from each other in this little town in Oregon, and we spent all of our time with each other. And I remember my lawnmower broke, and I hated mowing the lawn. It was the most vain task to me, and I just
Amen.
It begrudged me that I had to mow my lawn at all. I was always just like, I'd just get a goat and let the goat take care of it. It seemed like the most vain exercise to me. But I lived in an area where people cared if you mowed your lawn, so I did. And I was complaining to my friend that my lawnmower broke, and now I'm gonna have to go find a lawnmower, and I hate doing that task anyhow. And he said, that's funny. Mine just broke too. And I was like, well, we live 3 blocks from each other. Why do we need 2 lawnmowers? Like, how often do you use a lawnmower? Like, you only use it once a week at the most. So why don't we go together? We'll buy one that's twice as nice. It'll cost each of us half as much, and we'll just share a lawnmower. Why not? And made all the sense in the world. And then once you do that, then you're like, well, could we do that with a wheat grinder? How about a car? Like, what could we do that would be better to do together than doing by myself? And we kind of reinvented Christian community in that sense. Like, it wasn't any grand spiritual effort. It was just practicality. And then the more that we lived that way, the more it made sense. And the more we started seeing these things in the scriptures, and we were like, hey, that's an idea worth pursuing. And so, but then what I found is that once I started moving that direction intellectually and spiritually, most people who embrace those ideas are doing them in these very rural environments. And that's not for no reason. Land is expensive. And if you're going to have a bunch of people, you need a bunch of land. And so people with those kinds of ideas gravitate towards rural environments. Right. But that wasn't what I wanted. I wasn't doing it just to have an increased economy personally. I figured early on that whatever benefit there was for the people of God living together and sharing in a community, that benefit had a direct output to making friends of the mammon of unrighteousness. That together we could do things in a community that we couldn't do alone. That our increase in our efficiency and economy could be an output of the church to benefit people who struggled in our communities where you lived. Well, if you live in the middle of Kentucky, that's nobody. There's nobody to benefit from that. But if you live in Boston or South Chicago or somewhere else, there's plenty of people that could benefit from those things. There was also my work in evangelism as a street evangelist early on was disappointing. We did a lot. We were out most weekends at the frat houses and on the college and downtown and in city festivals and all kinds of stuff. And I spent years kind of borrowing and stealing every moment of attention from people walking by that I could, to relatively little effect as far as making disciples. Right. And I spent a lot of years thinking about that proposition. Like, it wasn't for lack of zeal, and it wasn't for lack of man hours, but I wasn't seeing. I would go out and I would always have some good experience. There would be somebody that I'd talk to that I felt like was worth being there for, but I wasn't making disciples by and large. And I asked myself over and over again, I would come home from those weekends and I'd be like, Lord, I see you saying, look, the fields are white unto harvest. Pray the Lord of the harvest is in labors in the field. And I'm out here and I'm working week after week after week. And I don't see this white harvest. I don't see it. And that doesn't cause me to disbelieve your words. I must be doing something wrong. So is it methodology? Is it time and place? Are those, do we need to suffer persecution to see fruit? Like what's the piece that's missing in why for all of the work that I'm doing, I'm not seeing fruit? Right. And what I began to realize is that, so I lived 20 miles north of the city where I was street preaching. And for the homeless people, the drug addicts, and the party kids that I was preaching to, the 20 miles between them and me might as well have been 200 miles. And I was going into a place where I didn't live, and I was saying something that people didn't want to hear. And even if they were provoked enough to be intrigued, like curious, I was inaccessible because I was gone. And I began to embrace this idea that the preaching of the gospel has not actually been thoroughly communicated if it doesn't end with a come and see. So I can go into a place and I can say, Jesus has the answers for what ails humanity. He's making a new nation, he's making a new people, and you can be a part of that, and it will change who you are. But if I can't conclude that statement by saying, so why don't you come over Tuesday and see what that looks like? See my family, see my community, see how we live, see who we are. And I haven't properly communicated the gospel. And so my ideas all coalesced into this idea of urban Christian community, that we needed to be in places where we were visible, where we could have an effect, and where we could be known in a broader community if we wanted to be effective for the gospel.
So let's go back to
we just jumped right in, didn't we?
Let's go back to that first community. Yeah. I didn't realize, I would have been vaguely aware of that first community, but so what made that community, how did you start that community to start with? And then did you just leave, or did it disintegrate, or what happened?
No, it's still going. It's still a good church. It was called Valley Christian Fellowship in Halsey, Oregon. That would have been, like I said, it would have been the early 2000s, and it was really born out of a few of us who were street preaching together. And we, at that time in our lives, we were going there were three of us who had left the evangelical world. I was coming from the Baptist churches. Actually, all of us were coming from the Baptist churches. And we had been kind of radicalized by the scriptures, by these ideas about obedience, especially the Sermon on the Mount, kingdom concepts. I didn't know there was a framework for that at that point, but we were being radicalized by the scriptures. And we happened to find out that there were Anabaptists in our area. And so we were going to Sunday meetings at an Anabaptist church and then doing our own like evangelistic outreach in the evenings. And we were very young. I was in my early 20s, far too young to be starting churches for sure. But we were out street preaching one night, and we came home, like our wives and children would hang out in one of our places, and then we'd come home after Friday night of being out, and we would talk with the women and tell them how times were, and then we would all go home in the early hours of the morning. And we came home from street preaching one night, and I was kind of exasperated with this kind of lack of fruit. And what I told the guys that I said, my biggest concern is that someone's actually going to listen to us one of these times. Because if they do, like if we were to go out tonight and somebody would say, hey, I'm all in, like I hear you, I want to follow what you're talking about, I want to find the Lord, and I want to be a part of this nation, where are we going to take them? We can't go back to the Baptist church. We all just left there. And we can't take somebody like that to the Mennonite church. They can barely handle us, and we showed up really clean. So, like, what are we going to do? Like, I'm afraid of success. I'm afraid that somebody's actually going to listen to us. And so this is when we started having our own meetings. And when we started having our own meetings, about that time, we had come across Charity Christian Fellowship and started listening to tapes. And we were listening to a lot of tapes. And there was another brother who was a friend then and one of the first people to join that church, who was coming from the Mennonite church. And we had set up tape racks at the 2 truck stops in the central Willamette Valley. And so any trucker that stopped in the central Willamette Valley walked by one of our tape racks. So we were sending out hundreds and eventually thousands of tapes and CDs. There's our ambulance.
That's just proof that we're in Boston.
Yeah, right. Oh, it's police. So we were sending out hundreds and eventually thousands of material from Charity, and it caught attention back in Pennsylvania. They were like, we don't have a church out in Oregon. Why are we sending thousands of CDs and tapes out there? And about that time, we had started having our own meetings, and a couple of us started calling, trying to get a hold of Denny Keniston and asking him what we should do as young evangelists.
So you say young. You were in your 20s. Were you all in your 20s?
We were all in our 20s. All three of us were in our early 20s.
Wow.
I think 24, 23, and 22.
Oh, wow.
When I say early 20s, I mean early.
Yeah.
And when we finally got a hold of Brother Denny, we said, what should we do? Here's our situation. We don't know what to do. We don't really fit in the Anabaptist world. We know that already. And we don't fit in the evangelical world. We know that. So what are we supposed to do? And he said, his advice was, set yourselves a deadline. Give yourselves a few months and meet together and see what God does. And if he's in it, then you should stay with it. And if he's not, then you should find somewhere to take your families where you can be a part of a church. It's good advice. I've given that advice to a lot of people since. And the Lord did start doing things. People started getting saved, and people started coming to our meetings, and it seemed like the Lord was working with us. And so we just stuck it out and stayed with it. Eventually, we found some oversight from people in the Charity movement that helped us, and there ended up being it's kind of a sad story, but there ended up being some conflicts there, and I left in 2006, 2007.
And how far in was this when you finally left? Was that 5-6 years?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. The church was pretty well established. A lot was happening by then. I left, and I think that there's kind of cycles. I hope that's not too Eastern mysticism for people, but I have noticed in my life there's these kind of cycles where you kind of go around. I think it's the way that the way that the Lord teaches people. Like you get a shot at something, and if you don't get it, you come back around to it again. And I ended up back in Oregon after trying to start a community somewhere else. Actually, I was a part of a community in the Shenandoah Valley in Virginia. Was my first intentional community that I joined.
Wait a minute. So are you comfortable talking about that?
Yeah.
Because, I mean, that's what we're talking about is church planting. And so I really feel like, what do you call it, a postmortem or something like that is really important for some of those things because, like, if you say that didn't work, why didn't it work?
Well, it didn't work for me. It's a little bit hard to talk about, not because I'm not comfortable, but there are still people there.
Okay.
And there are still people who I'm friends with who were involved in those situations. And there's leadership that was involved in those situations that I had conflict with. And
we don't have to go down the rabbit hole.
Yeah, without discussing individuals and people who were involved, there was a different perspective between me and my leadership in how to deal with a situation that was sinful. And I didn't feel like we were addressing those issues the way that they should have been addressed. And I came into that kind of charity paradigm. I was very much, Denny in the charity circles was very influenced by like Bill Gothard and ATI. Okay. And that leadership, that way of viewing authority and leadership was kind of endemic in the charity circles, especially in the early 2000s, in ways that weren't always healthy.
Right.
And because of that, when I ran into conflict with my leadership, I told them I had a conflict in my conscience with what was happening, and I asked, I'm at the place where I can't keep going, and so what am I supposed to do? And the response to that was, you should leave without making a problem for people. And so I kind of just walked away.
Okay. So was that community set up more ideally, less ideally than what you would have wanted? Like as far as the community itself structure, not necessarily leadership or.
When the Bible says there's difference of administrations, I think there's a lot of ways to organize the church. I think there's a lot of ways to organize communities. And I think that that's a good thing in that the church is adaptable to multiple variants across time and place and people. She can fit into a lot of different places. I'm happy with how we set things up for that place and that time. But that particular structure and administration wouldn't work in other places where I've been.
So what type of structure?
Most of the churches that I've been involved in, so I was an unordained church planter until Boston. Okay. So I'd started I've been involved in the origin of 2 communities and tried a third before we came to Boston, which was my 4th, when I was finally ordained as a church planter. Okay. I was recently ordained to an eldership here, and so I'm moving away a little bit from my church planting responsibilities.
Does that de-ordain you as a church planter, or
no? And I'm encouraged that Peter even says I'm an apostle and an elder, okay. So there is a place to do both. But my calling here in Boston is such that the church really wants me to be focused on what's happening here, and so I won't be uninvolved in other places, but I'll be much less involved going forward for the next while, probably at least until we have more ministers here locally in Boston to help share that load. So
the church structure at
the church structures I've been involved in are very organic startup kind of churches. Boston is the most established, stable structure that I've been a part of. It's gone the longest, and it's grown out in the most. It has the most. It's developed the most maturity. Now, I'm not involved with the church in Oregon. They're 20 years old now, and so that's a mature church too. It has ministers ordained, and it's functioning well, and it's a stable church. But I wasn't a part of it after the origin in the original phase. So this is something we're talking about just generally, is that for people, because your podcast is about church planting, church planting work is startup work. And it's going to appeal to certain people in
Right.
certain places that it's not going to, until it's mature, it won't be a home for other kinds of personalities.
Right. Yeah.
Just because of the nature of the work. It's missional. And so you have to have like a high risk tolerance, a high apostolic tolerance, a high, you just have to you have to be a certain kind of person to start new churches, and even to come to new churches.
Right.
And so I've spent most of my Christianity in those environments, and I think a driving factor for me, because I also have a large family, is that I felt like for especially I would say most of my ministry, I've been trying to establish something that's stable enough where my children wouldn't have to do what I was trying to do when I was a young family man. A main goal, aside from my aspirations for the kingdom, my personal aspiration has been, when my children get married, I want them to just have a church that they can have children and be a young family with people around them, that they don't have to invent these things and figure out how to make church life work. And I'm finally at the place where that's happening, where my married children don't have to invent churches and communities and make a way for themselves in ways that we had to, my wife and I had to. And so that's really encouraging to me. And it's really encouraging to me to see the church planting kind of movement growing in ways that offer a potential for a much more stable way to do this, instead of kind of the wild, wild west way that we've been building churches, that I've been building churches for the last 20 years. I'm eager to see churches ordaining church planters and networks of people who are sharing insight and wisdom with each other and having these kinds of conversations. I spent a couple of years trying to start an urban community in Detroit, and I don't know if a lot of people now may not realize how avant-garde it was to talk about starting a Christian community with kingdom aspirations in an urban area even 15 years ago. Like, that conversation wasn't being had.
Yeah.
I searched high and low, hither and yon for anybody that was even willing to entertain the conversation in 2010, and there was very, very few people that would even talk about it.
Yeah.
And so I'm seeing now that this is a much more acceptable idea. I think some proof of concept, and seeing places like State College and Boston and other places, they're starting to say, hey, we can have more of an effect if we're in urban areas that are making the idea viable, and that can only do good things in the future.
Right. That proof of concept is huge, because 15 years ago, it was a crazy idea that you saw multiple Mennonite Anabaptist type churches have tried the dive in and dive out kind of missions that I think are...
Or remote missions. It's kind of like scattered, like send some people in on Sunday and then they live back here.
Yeah, that's what I mean by dive in, dive out. Like, you might own a church building in downtown, but nobody lives there.
Yeah, right.
So that kind of a church, I don't even want to call it church planting. I'm not sure what that was. It was church missions. But most of those have either... most of those have not done what they intended them to do.
Right.
And so proof of concept is I think, really important, in which I think people doing something that actually works and seeing it work for a little while. And there's so many questions, like one question that comes up with most Anabaptists immediately, like the first thing they're going to talk about when you're talking about starting a church in the city is, what happened to your children?
How do you raise children in the city?
That is like it seems like it's like the elephant. Like,
right.
Everybody, they can get past everything, okay, we can get past housing, we can get past job, we can get past all this stuff, but when we get to children, so
what do we say to people?
Yeah, so what's your answer?
I mean,
you have 12 children, right?
I have 12, yeah. I have 5 grandchildren now. 2 of my children are married, and a third will marry this fall. And we've been in Boston for some of their whole childhoods. We've been here for 13 years now, so some of them have been born and raised in this area. It's a funny thing to me. you're right that it is a very, very common hesitation and fear that people have. It's hard for me because it's never one that I owned. Like, it never made sense to me.
So you never got the argument.
It never appealed to
Okay.
me at all. I had moved out into the country in my, when I'm listening to Denny Keniston 10 hours a week. I love Brother Denny. He was a huge influence in my life. And I thought back then, like, you had to go out into the country and have a lawn furniture business and goats and chickens for the boys to take care of in order to have a godly family.
Right.
And so I kind of bought the idea, but it was so conflicting with my aspirations for the gospel that it never really took root. Like, I wanted my life because of, I think because of how Erica and I were converted and coming from the streets. I knew that's where I belonged. I knew that my obligation, my debt to the gospel, like Paul talks about as a debt to the Gentiles. I had an obligation to the gospel because I was redeemed. And that's never been secondary to me. It's always been like a primary driver of my faith. And it's had a lot of different manifestations, but I always knew that's what my life was for. And so anything that didn't line up with that goal I couldn't put in a primary position. And so, and I think maybe because of the way we were converted, but I didn't have any notions that there was this godly pastoral life that was one way to live, and there was this urban, debauched, wicked way to live. When you talk about that particular set of issues and concerns, I think that, there's a handful of new urban Anabaptist or Anabaptist sympathizing churches, and the uptake for them in making disciples is hard. And I think that it's a part of that difficulty is that I was just sharing with a brother a couple of weeks ago from a startup church. My neighbors are not aliens to me. I don't come from a different world than them. I didn't grow up in an Anabaptist church. I grew up in an evangelical church, and I grew up in Southern California. And I don't see people living in cities as some kind of other, as some kind of like foreign native heathens that live in this other world that's disconnected from me, and I'll sacrifice whatever it is to go live in these foreign lands. Like, they're just my neighbors. Like, the only difference between me and my neighbors is our worldviews. Like, they're not aliens to me, and I'm not an alien to them. I understand them. I live in their world. I live in their culture. And so I don't have that and that's an advantage that I have, I think. There are some disadvantages of not growing up in a godly Anabaptist environment, but that's one of the advantages of not being in that isolated environment, that I don't live in an alien world. And so the idea that I couldn't raise my children in an urban area never had any teeth for me. Now that I'm here and I know a lot of people who are coming from those places, the way I try to sympathize with the argument is I say, it's kind of like, if you look at America as a country, a lot of our differences, a lot of the political differences, for instance, really come down to urban versus rural thinking. It's why the cities tend to be liberal and the country tends to be conservative. And that's not because people automatically filter those ways. It's because it's different ways of living. Like, if you think about all of the political implications of how we live, the places where we live, if I live and it's a quarter mile down my lane till my neighbor's house, I don't care how he builds his house. I don't care if he follows building codes or what he does with his electrical work. Right. If I can spit out my window and hit my neighbor's house, I care a lot about how his house is wired and whether or not it's going to light on fire. If I live out in the country, I'm going to have a wood stove. I'm going to have a garden, and I live in a way that that tends towards independence and autonomy. But here, right now, my city, the trash is on strike. And so, like, we have a problem as a whole community of where people's trash is going to go. Like, what happens here affects all of us.
Right.
Policing, like all of these things, like the Western ideas that I grew up under, like mind your own business. When we moved to Boston, there was a little bit of a cultural shock from growing up in the West, like how much people are in each other's business here in an urban area is just a whole different way of living. But people have a lot more to do with each other. What you do in an urban environment affects me in ways that it doesn't in a rural environment. And so the ideas of community versus autonomy are rural versus urban ideologies. And so all of that affects. So if you're talking about raising children, there's a different skill set for raising children in an urban environment than in a rural environment. You know, open the back door and let the children go out and play is a way to live in the country that we don't have access to. Now, are we better or worse for it? Well, I mean, there's some idyllic ways of living childhood that's really fun and nice to grow up that way. But you also don't have constraints or obligations or supervision like you do in other environments. So there's this give and take both ways, and one isn't better or worse. They're just very different. And so if you're going to raise a family in an urban area, you have to ideally you want to profit off of what's available to you within that environment. So like I have cultural institutions instead of agricultural institutions. You know, my children grow up meeting people from Sudan and Saudi Arabia and Vietnam and Laos, and we meet people from all over the world all the time. And that's our so if I'm a rural kid living in Oklahoma, I know trees and I know an ash tree from a scrub oak, and I'm learning about the natural environment in ways that those are worshipful. You can praise God for all those things. My children learn about people who are coming from all over the world. We have access to art museums and science museums and cultural institutions and things that a country kid doesn't have access to. So it's not that one is better than the other. As far as like how you raise your children, though, if we have to be in rural environments to have godly children, that's not a gospel that I want. Like, I don't want a church, a way of believing in the faith that only works in a certain environment. It's antithetical to what I know about God in the scriptures. Of course, he's just as available to me in the city as he is in the country. And if you do any kind of like thinking about it, we all know that's true. I mean, you have just as much trouble with boys out behind the barn as you do boys around the corner. Like, there's trouble to be had no matter where you live.
But the same thing you say about your building code, for instance.
Right.
You know, if it's a mile to my nearest neighbor, I don't care if they do drugs.
Right.
I mean, kind of.
Yeah.
But if my nearest neighbor is
selling crack
50 feet away,
right,
or closer,
right,
and they're selling drugs out their back door,
yeah,
and peddling to my teenage sons, then we have a whole different, like, there needs to be some different framework.
Well, I mean, I think what I would say is that if your son is susceptible to the neighbor selling drugs, you have problems way before the neighbor selling drugs.
So how do we address those problems? I mean, what are your tips on creating resilient children that you
right.
can kick out at, as a teenager without having to worry too much? I mean, obviously everybody's got their temptations, but
right.
Like,
I think that what I would say is that my way of being, my ideas about being a father apply equally in both environments. So like being a good father is translocal. Like it doesn't matter if you live in an urban or a rural area. Being a good father is what prevents your children from being drugs, because there's drugs to be had in the country. My wife grew up in rural Oregon, in Turner, Oregon. They did more drugs there than you can shake a stick at. isolation from urbanity is not a protection from sin or temptation or drugs or anything else or pornography. And certainly now in a digital age, this is another way to think about these things, is that in a digital age, like we're either going to make like Amish style decisions where we're going to withdraw from the world writ large. We're going to live in an entirely different world than the people in our time and day. And if that's the case, then the Amish were right and we should probably be looking at them. Or we're going to figure out how to live in this world with the things that it has, including the digital scape, and find tools and ways for being in this world that don't require us prohibiting certain ways of being. And if we're so what I would say is that there's less and less isolation even to be had in a rural environment in a digital world, in a connected world.
People are not as isolated as they think.
No, they're certainly not. And so all of the ideology that somehow living out in the country and being on a farm is going to protect my children from pornography because they can't find a magazine somewhere just isn't a concern anymore. You have to, as a father, be thinking about how am I going to protect my children in their character and the way that they think about the world, in how they're connected and what their values are. And we can't rely on isolation to make those decisions.
So what are some ways to actually make that happen?
Well, I think good relationships. I mean, we have preaching on family stuff. I mean, all the things that people know, but real intimate connections with your children are primary. But here's the other thing that I'll say about that is that I think that my children have benefited from growing up in a home that puts the gospel as a high priority. Now, what I mean by that is that if you're in a church where there hasn't been a convert in 20 years, it's very easy to grow up in a church like that and think that this worldview that we have is just for us. It's an ethno-religion.
Okay, yeah.
If you grow up in a home where you see different people from different ethnicities, from different religions, from different worldviews, embracing the gospel of the kingdom and becoming converts and joining the community, you, without ever thinking about it, you internalize the idea that this is not just my parents' religion. This is not an ethno-religion. This is something that applies to all people in all places. It's assimilable. It's something for everyone.
Something that other people want too, not just
right.
You don't have to be born.
You don't have to be born here in order for this to make sense. And I think that's a huge benefit. And that benefit is hard to come by if you aren't in a place that has a diversity of people coming in. And the rationale for being in an urban area is just that I think that Jesus said that there's a narrow gate and few there be that find it. And I think that if we're serious about the gospel, if we're serious about affecting the world around us, praise God. Like if the Christianity I can live in an urban area or a rural area. It doesn't change me. But what I'm doing with my life and my ministry has a very big differential potential in those two environments. And so if my life is about that ministry and that what I'm producing for the kingdom of God, what I'm going to take into eternity with me, then it takes a lot of people. And kind of coming full circle, back to when I was on the streets doing evangelism and feeling like kind of lackluster in my fruit. I don't live that way anymore. I have changed to where now, at this stage in my life, I spend more time trying to figure out what I'm not going to do than what I'm going to do. I spend more time trying to evaluate what's the greatest potential, not what's a potential.
You have no time for street ministry anymore.
I haven't done street ministry in a long time, and there's some different reasons.
A good problem to have, huh?
Yeah, I feel like my time is more useful in one-on-one engagements with people who are already interested. Yeah. I also do a lot more church work now too, right. But even when it comes to evangelism, I have more opportunities sitting with people one-on-one than having to go out and try to get somebody interested enough to sit down and have coffee with me.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Because that is a problem with church, with street ministries, is that you have even if, I mean, like you said, your fear of success. Like I had that. Like I used to, when I was really young, I did some street ministry with my dad, and we talked about like the group of us that did it. We talked about like if we do actually catch a fish, what are we going to do with it?
Yeah.
Because we had a little bit different. We had a little bit different worldview than the rest of the people in our church.
Yeah.
As when it came to evangelism. So when you're actually, it just makes it tough. Like, what do you do with a fish?
Yeah.
So living in a community that cares makes a lot more sense.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, that's definitely. So we have missionaries that go all over the world.
Yeah.
And take their families with them. And a decent percentage of the time, they move back because their children can't handle being on the mission field. The parents are usually all about missions.
Right.
But the children just can't, somehow they can't handle both.
Right.
What's going on there? Like,
well, I think in that case, it's the foreign aspect. It's the being an alien. So I have some controversial ideas about this whole issue. Coming through the charity circles, missions was a big part of charity's values. And I grew up in an evangelical world where missions were really important. I have come to be, how do I say it delicately? I respect the sacrifice that people are willing to make for the gospel. I don't take any exception with the motives and the values of people who are willing for even in our past, people that have made those sacrifices and gone and translated the scriptures and gone to unreached people groups. God bless them. I'm glad for their work and their sacrifice and their labors, as a caveat, to make it clear. However, in the 21st century, as a church planter, as someone who's thinking about how does the church engage with the world with the gospel to the greatest value and the greatest fruit, I am more than skeptical of Western foreign missions. And there's at the entry level, there's some colonial aspects to that. I think that working in the post-colonial world as a white person who is a foreigner to that place, whether it's in Asia or Africa or even South America, being a white person from a colonial country in a post-colonial country is a whole set of problems that is very, very difficult to untangle. We have a sister community in Kampala, and to disentangle whiteness from evangelical work in Kampala is a Gordian's knot that I'm not sure can be untied. Like, there's no way to get away from the implications of being white in Africa. Like, you're such a foreigner that even if you live in a slum, you're still a white guy that lives in a slum. It can never not be that. And so you're never not different from the people that you're trying to make a church with. And if we're talking about language work and pioneering work and being the first person on the ground and first contact, that kind of stuff, I'm sure there's still a place for it, but there's fewer and fewer places like that. The thing that makes more sense to me strategically is that in America and in the West, broadly, including Europe, every single country has literally come to our door. That neighborhood in New York City has 200 ethnicities within a 10-block radius. It's the most multi-ethnic place in the world. And so if I meet a person who says, I really have a burden for Saudis, or I really have a burden for Laotians, or I really have a burden for Chinese people, or Russians, or Bulgarians, or Romanians, or you name it, pick the country, I can send them some. We have people in our community who speak Bangladeshi, white kids who speak Bangladeshi. That's a really rare skill. there are Bangladeshi communities in several large cities in America. If I was thinking strategically, what makes more sense? To send somebody, okay, so I love this particular people enough that I learned their language, whether it's Arabic or Chinese or whatever it is. I love them enough that I'm willing to learn their language. That's no small thing. Praise God. What's more efficient, to go be a foreigner and a stranger in that place, or to be here in America and reach that community who's already here and make converts in a church among those people here, and have those people go back to their own people and make churches out of native people?
Well, that'd be amazing.
It's infinitely more efficient. I could do in Uganda, like speaking to our own experience, right. I can do in Uganda with 3 Ugandan brothers what I could send an army of white people and 100 times the cost to do. And they would never do it as well. Real, genuine converts to kingdom ideology in America of any nation on earth that you want to work with is the way to win the world for the gospel. I really, really believe this. I'm not saying there's no work to be done for
right.
language translation and pioneering work and whatever, but just in general, most people, and here's what it does. It does 2 things right off the bat. It's incredibly more efficient as far as costs is concerned, resources in the kingdom. But the other thing it does is that, well, it purifies my motives, right, as the worker, because there's a whole kind of like mythology around the missionary that right. it's hard to get away from in our own egos. Like, if you grew up with a dad reading you missionary stories, I read them to my kids, and this like missionary heroism. Denny used to sell a book called Missionary Heroism. I read it to my kids. This hero ideology of the people who go out and do those things. Well, that's implicit in some of the motivation. So it's really hard to get away from. And how would you know if that's what was motivating you or not? You can't. But if you do it in Brooklyn, like, there's no hero to be had. You're just a guy that lives in Brooklyn who loves these people. Like, so it purifies the worker and it purifies the receivers. Like, when you work, especially in that post-colonial world, the idea of the ticket to America is so implicit. Right. And even if it's not the ticket to America, the things that are afforded by right. coming from the West that you have access to with that connection that you wouldn't otherwise, all of that gets purified. So nobody in Brooklyn, if you want to talk to Vietnamese people and you love Vietnamese people and you go to a community in LA, let's say LA, you go to LA because you want to work with Vietnamese people. Well, none of the Vietnamese people there have anything to gain by listening to you.
Right.
They have no more advantage. Right. And by the time they're willing to go back to Vietnam, they're actually sacrificing a ton to be able to go back. So it purifies motives across the board. It really is an exquisite way to think about foreign missions.
Yeah, wow, that is amazing, because I've been thinking about, I've heard like what really brought me to church planting in the U.S. is the realization of this mission with your caveats, right. Problems in the mission.
Right.
And some pretty close experience with that.
Uh-huh.
So that's what brought me to church. Like, I was like, well, okay, forget that. Like, we could easily we haven't even reached the whole U.S. Like, why are we trying to go to Africa?
Well, here's the other thing that really like stoked this in me is that we were sending people overseas at great expense because they felt the call or the burden. And I'm like, we need a better vetting process. Like, what are we exporting?
Right.
If you haven't made disciples in America, what business do you have going to China to start a church? It's crazy to me. If you want to, anybody who came to me and said, Matthew, I want to start a church in China, I would say, where have you made Chinese converts here? Because there's Chinese people here. So if you care about that community, make disciples here. Show me that you can do that. And if you're so good at making Chinese disciples in America that we're like, wow, this guy really knows what he's doing with Chinese people, then maybe we should consider exporting him to China to start churches in China. But until you've worked with that population here, where there's way less risk, there's way less cost, there's way less difficulty, you're in your home environment with, all the access to things that we have here. Like, if you can't make Chinese disciples here, you have no business going over there. And for decades, if not centuries, let's say decades for sure, we've been sending people who are not proven, who are not vetted, who don't have successful ministries in America overseas to start churches. And then they have all kinds of hardships and difficulties and trials, physically, economically, spiritually, and they come back and they're hurt and they're beaten, dejected, because they feel like they went out to go fight a war that they either weren't prepared for or weren't equipped for or whatever. And people lose their faith over it. They lose their children over it. They lose all kinds of things over it. And it's just because we're not thinking wisely about how we do this work.
And the interesting thing about it is that you pay all this money for training to send people over, and if people are developing their own ministries here, it's free. Their training is free.
Right.
And the other thing is, there are church groups that send people to the foreign missions. Mm-hmm. They ordain them to preach in foreign missions, but when they come home, they don't preach in the U.S.
Right.
Like, we trust them to preach to the heathen, but they can't preach to the choir.
And it all ends up feeling like a white savior mentality to me. Like, that's good enough for those people, but not for us. And I think that there's just a lot of implications from this whole ideology. We're not being faithful with our work here. Like, we're not thinking about church planting. Like, when somebody tells me, "Hey, I really like what's happening in Boston. I'd like to consider moving there," I treat that situation like I would treat somebody on a mission board that wants to go to China. Like, why do you want to come here? What are you going to contribute to the work of the church here? Like, why should you move here? What are you bringing to the ministries of the church, to the values of the church? What are you contributing to the work of the church if you're going to come and take a seat at this table? Because there's a certain number of seats at the table. And so if somebody's here and they're not contributing, and that's a little bit one-sided. Of course, sometimes people come because they have their own personal problems that need ministered to, whatever. But at least let's be upfront about that. Right. At least let's know what we're doing. Like, we're not just coming to a place just to come. And so we're not thinking strategically about domestic churches. We're not thinking strategically about international churches. And the net effect of all of it is that we're just very inefficient gospel workers. We're not doing a good job with what our main task for the gospel is. And this is the thing that is one of my biggest burdens, is that I just don't feel like, as Christians in America, I can't speak for other places, that we're doing a good job of being ministers for the gospel. Like, if I was to grade us, and I'm talking about us, like kingdom people, like really serious, I love Jesus, I'm all about it, I live my life, I'm a 7 day a week Christian, I'm not like go to church on Sunday kind of guy. I'm all in. I know the scriptures. I love Jesus. I'm raising my family for God. Us. If I was to grade us with what we're doing with the gospel, I dare say we'd barely eke out a D if we were grading ourselves. It's not good.
Wow. So I was listening to some people talk about foreign missions, and they were talking about a similar thing. Like, foreign missions have been, especially in the evangelical world, I won't talk about the Mennonite world because they're probably the ones listening. They've been really abused because people have said, let's go for a vacation in Guatemala,
right?
And a paid vacation, and it's not a paid vacation. Obviously, it's hard work and it's not fun, and there's all kinds of bad things, but there's still the missionary heroism thing. Right. Like, okay, well,
I did something noble.
Right. I want to go do something noble with my life, and let's go to Guatemala. But this was an evangelical man. He was saying that he can go to, say, Guatemala and pull together some pastors, train them, and do the work. Like he can go for 2 days a month fly down there and back, cheap plane ticket, train some pastors once a month, and then there doesn't have to be anybody living there. He can fly there.
Right.
He can fly there, and if they have a problem, they can call him up. He can be there in 2 days.
We have Skype, we have phones, we have access, and that's the other thing is that I don't feel like we're making as good a use out of our technology that we could. I mean, I think about what the apostles would have done with modern transportation and communication technology that I can hardly imagine.
So your idea of like just export the gospel, not us, makes sense. Like,
and so here's the thing, like, so a lot of us have experience with like a short-term mission when we were young, and it kind of opened our eyes to the developing world, and it made us have sympathies for the poor and whatever. And I think there's a net value in those things. Right. So how do we have kind of our cake and eat it too? And I think there's a way. I think if we would start thinking about humanitarianism, like what do we have and what do we not have? Well, I don't think that Americans are particularly noteworthy for our faith. Like our ability to believe in God for things. I don't think we're particularly necessary for people to believe the gospel. Like I don't think that I'm the missing piece to people believing the gospel. The scriptures are pretty well settled in most places. What do we have as Americans? Well, we have money and resources. Sometimes we have disposable time. We have medicine and training. We have intellectual values like speaking foreign language, speaking biblical languages, or we could teach on pedagogy or hermeneutics or Bible study, or like there are things that we have to offer.
We have the time to invest into the. I mean, we have the resources to be able to invest the time into that kind of education.
So if we think globally as Americans, there are things that we have to contribute to the purposes of the gospel in other parts of the world. But I would recommend we take a step back with our ego and say that we aren't the key to the world being saved, but what we have, we want to offer to people. And that's primarily humanitarian stuff, unless we have developed a particular ministry and skill to be able to do something for the church that's proven at home that we're exporting. But in general, like we could send teams of kids to go out and do disaster relief. We can do humanitarian work. And so, like I'm speaking from my own experiences. We worked with a CAM International Crisis budget to develop housing for South Sudanese refugees in central Uganda. I was primarily involved in that project on the ground. The brothers in Kampala and Brother Charlton were huge and instrumental in it too. But I was back and forth in Uganda a lot. And I felt good about doing humanitarian work. Like that's wonderful things for the Christian community to be doing. Like we should, as Westerners, we should be involved in humanitarian work. We should be helping in Ukraine. We should be helping in Gaza. We should be helping in any place where we can pour in the things that we have an abundance of. I just don't know I don't know that we do well for those places or for ourselves by thinking that we're with these white savior mentalities. Like if we don't go and take the gospel, like I would way rather Palestinians preach the gospel in Gaza than Americans. I would way rather Chinese people preach the gospel in China. Like that just is sensible to me.
Yeah, makes sense.
America's unique in that we're a multi-ethnic country, and there are some other countries like us. But there again, like let's think about what we have access to. What are the particular resources that we as Americans have that we can leverage for the kingdom of God? And it's being in these melting pot places that the whole world historically has wanted to come to. And so we have access to resources that most of the world doesn't have. We have access to education that most of the world doesn't have. And we have access to demographics that most of the world doesn't have. And those are things that we should, and I would say it this way, until we've done a good job of exploiting those things, we probably don't have much business working past that. Like, let's start there.
So how, in this, so you're in Boston. I guess this is your third attempt?
Yeah. It's really my fourth.
Okay, fourth.
Yeah.
With the one being...
So Oregon, I was in Stewart Straff, Virginia. I tried to do something in Detroit that never took off, and then I came to Boston.
The Detroit thing never took off.
Yeah.
And when was that?
That was before I came here, so it was like 2011, 12.
So did you live up there for a while?
I did, yeah.
I didn't realize you ever lived in Detroit.
Yeah. It was outside of Detroit in Tecumseh, but I was trying to move into Detroit.
Yeah. All right. But that just, you weren't able to get people together for that?
It was a unique opportunity. It was actually a secular project that they wanted to start an urban farming project in Detroit, and I had access to kind of like the ground level of this project.
I'd have joined you.
Yeah. Well, that was my idea. I told the guy who was running the project, I said, they were going to just demolish houses and turn it into farm ground. Mm-hmm. I said, well, save a few houses. I'll move people in and we'll live there and work your farm for you. It's like the best of both worlds. It was a fantastic idea. I'll put this out here. I was just in Detroit last weekend, and I still believe it's one of the most fertile places for the gospel in America today. I thoroughly believe if you look across the American landscape, the best place to plant a church right now would be in Detroit. Wow. And the window is closing. It's been open for 10 years, but it's closing.
Why Detroit?
Well, it's the opposite of Boston in a lot of ways. If there's a housing bubble here, there's a housing vacuum there. Mm-hmm. It's still a place where it's a place where it's easy to make a living. Let me rephrase that. If your wages are not tied to the local economy, it's a very good place to live. If your wages are tied to the local economy, it's still pretty tough. But there's a lot of our people who are young professionals who work in IT, who do something remote that make a decent wage that could live really well in Detroit. Housing is cheap. There's a lot of opportunity. There's a lot of space. So there's a lot of opportunity to coordinate housing and live in neighborhoods together. There's terrible needs there. The culture is tired and could use stimulus of people who love those people and love that area and want to invest in those communities. There's just a whole set of it's multi-ethnic. Dearborn is a huge concentration of immigrant Muslims from all over the Arab world and the South Asian world. Like, there's a huge population of Muslim people there. The African American community there has a lot of needs and openness, and that's another place where we as the church have really failed in making converts out of African Americans. So there's just a lot of opportunities in that particular place that aren't in other places when I look across America.
So why do you say the window is rapidly closing?
Well, because the city's kind of healing, like it's getting better slowly.
So that real estate crash back in 2000 or whenever that was, or was it 2008?
Yeah.
When did they Detroit crashed before the real
Detroit's been bad for a long time. The years I was there, I spent a year there trying to get the farming project going, and there were 3 mayors the year I was there. It was the Kwame Kilpatrick years, and he went to jail, and the next guy left, and the third guy came. And I think that year that I was there, 7 of the 11 outgoing city council members were on either being federally investigated or indicted for corruption. Just a really corrupt city in those years. And there's a lot of problems in Detroit, but strong, stable communities are a part of the answer. Like, the church has something to do with helping heal that area and making it better for everyone.
So that was your third one, then Boston was the fourth.
Oregon, I was in the Shenandoah Valley in Stewart Straff. Detroit was the third, and then Boston was the fourth. Yeah.
Did you move here from Boston, or did you go somewhere else did you move here from Detroit?
Yeah, circuitously. I actually went back to Oregon.
Okay.
A couple of times. That's what I was talking about, the cycles. I never really got back to it. Okay. Is that I was back in Oregon. I think this is important in my church planting work. I was back in Oregon, and we had started that church originally from the ground up through evangelism and loving people and caring for one another. And so when I went back, I didn't go back to my old church. I didn't know what I was going to do. It was just a place where I knew how to live, and I just ended up back there. And there had been a couple more splits from that church that I had started after I left. And for different reasons than what happened with me. And so there was a group of people who had kind of like some connections there and a few that didn't, we all started hanging out together. And it was long enough that we were doing pretty much everything but having church together. We were hanging out together all the time. We were even doing some evangelistic work together. We were, just everything, but none of us wanted to have church meetings. And so on Sunday we would go somewhere else, and then we'd hang out together all week. Like, it was a community that wasn't having meetings. And a group of those brothers this was happening with all of us. They finally came to me after a few months, and they were like, "Hey, we started a church before. Let's do this again. Like, we're doing everything but having communion together. We might as well just start meeting together, and let's start over." And something didn't seem right about that to me. I was just uncomfortable with the idea, and I wasn't sure why. And so after we had met and talked about it, I said, well, let's pray about it. We'll think about it. And so I spent some time talking with Erica and praying about it. And I just didn't feel like it was the right thing to do. And so we met again, those guys and I, in my shed. And I said, hey, listen, I know what's going to happen. We're going to meet together. It's going to be great. We'll start preaching together. Homeless people will hang out. Like, we'll have ministry to do. It'll be wonderful for a few years. And then something's going to happen, and we'll start fighting with each other, and we'll split apart. And then I'm going to be back in the same place again. It'll just be 6 years later, and I'm going to be right back to square one. And I said, that's the problem we have to solve. Like, we have to figure out why this pattern keeps happening to us. And until we've figured that out, I don't feel like it makes any sense to try to go forward. Like, we kind of need to go backwards to go forward. Mm-hmm. And so what I told them then is, I said, I don't know what you guys are going to do. I'm going to go back to Valley. And there had been the kind of problems when I left that made that. I was eating a lot of crow to go back there. And it was kind of a radical idea. And that's why it felt right. Like, I'm a Christian because I believe in radical Jesus discipleship. Like, I believe he is a radical teacher. He's this radical, homeless Hebrew in Palestine saying things that strike against all of our natural inclinations. That's why I love him. And the places where I live in that space are the places where I feel closest to him. Like, doing things that are against my nature and for God are the and so this felt like one of those things. Like, I don't want to go back there. I'm offended. I'm offensive. Have all these things. I don't want to go back there. So that obviously is the way. That's what I should do, right?
Right.
So I told them that, and they all thought I was crazy. And so we went back. So I went back that next Sunday, and everybody else went back too. We doubled the size of the church that week. Wow. And then we just kept going. And it was uncomfortable for those brothers there. They were like, what are you taking over a church or whatever? And there were some uncomfortable conversations, and there was some awkwardness, and they were like, you can't have communion here. You can't come to our brothers' meetings. We're still, there's still problems. And I was like, I'm not asking for that. That's not what I'm here for. I'm just here because you guys are my brothers and my sisters, and I don't feel like things are resolved, and you're not going to call the cops on me. So I'm just going to keep coming until I figure out what God's doing here. And God started answering our prayers, and he started mending relationships, and he started making things whole. And I watched like a 3-way split out of a charity church. People from a 3-way split all come back together and be in harmony again. And God start ministering to us collectively again. And I was like, that's it. That's the ticket. Like, you just have to have something that's more important than whatever your beef is, that you're willing to reconcile relationships about. When you're not like, I left the back. So this is something I think the charity people, especially the charity experiment, has never really articulated or resolved, is that we find radicals who are willing to leave, whether it's an Anabaptist church or an evangelical church. And there's something that's important to us enough in the scriptures or our conscience that we're willing to tell people that we love, tell our families, tell people who taught us in the faith, tell people who are all of our experiences and our values. even though it offends you, I'm going to obey God. And so we walk away from wherever we're coming from. And then we collect together. And when we collect together, we have all of this propensity to see something that I think that you don't think, and I'm going to split with you over it. Like if I was willing to split with my dad and my aunts and my uncles and everybody who baptized me and brought me into the faith, and I'm going to tell them, I don't care what you say, I'm going to go God's way. Well, I'm certainly going to say that to you. I don't even know you that well. Of course, I'm going to split with you when I have a different idea.
Right.
And this is the pattern. And there has to be some way to break that pattern. We have to figure out what is more important than my ideology. What is more important? Like, how do I have both of those values? How do I have enough strength in my convictions that I'm willing to follow and go upstream? And enough, one of those convictions has to be that I'm willing to compromise where it's not necessary in order to preserve the church and the work that we do in common that I can't do alone. That has to be one of the things that is in my core values. And it doesn't often end up in our core values. And so there's this easy propensity to keep splitting and keep dividing and keep breaking off that we haven't, by and large, as a people, worked out the resolution to. So going through those experiences in Oregon on my cycle through, after I had that experience and I had reconciled those relationships, and those people are now they're still my friends. We call each other on the phone. People that I fell out with, I love, not all of them, but most of them. I'm happy for what's happening there. There's no hard feelings. They've been, they can be happy when they hear things are happening in Boston. Mm-hmm. I can be happy when I hear, like, all of that's resolved. I felt like after I went through those experiences and put that in my values, then I was able to go forward. And not long after that, then I ended up meeting Finney through some providential meetings, and we ended up coming here to Boston. But without those experiences, I feel like I still would have been stuck in that looped pattern and not being able to see it. It's not even so much that, like, where are the particular issues that is going to raise that, because you never know. It changes from time to time, place to place, and person to person. But how do you recognize that pattern?
That is a great, that's a pattern that we all, I think most of us understand and recognize, that if you have especially like at State College, if somebody's coming in, we want to know what kind of conflict they had in their past and how they handled it.
Right.
Because I don't care if it's if it's the First Baptist Church or if it's the Methodist Church or if it's the Catholic Church.
Right.
If you had a conflict, you're going to handle the conflict you have with us a very similar way.
Right.
Probably.
And we're probably going to have conflicts.
We probably are. So to know how that conflict was handled kind of gives you a little bit of understanding of how the person understands conflict, and also how they process it and how they react to it,
and how they've learned from failure.
Right. And if they have learned anything.
Right.
So that makes a lot of sense. I see that happen pretty regular, as people rarely, unless they really say, oh, well, we've learned,
mm-hmm.
they very rarely change their pattern of conflict.
Right.
It's, either it's explode and lay down fire, or it's hide and run, or whatever. It's
because of the highest stress moments that people have in their lives, and so who you are at your core comes out of those places.
And I think that is huge in like, that's what I see I shouldn't say every, but there's so many church plants either fail or explode in the first 10 years.
Yeah.
Like, that is just, that is a repeating pattern.
Right.
Because a lot of people have come together, like you said.
Right.
They've rejected everything, they've came together, new radical ideas, and then all of a sudden, you and I don't see eye to eye, and we just can't do church together.
Right.
So I think that's really core to, but I can't figure out, in spite of knowing that, it seems like it just happens over and over and over.
Yeah, I want to, it's something that I'm trying to work on among our people and our churches, that I think it's I don't deal with an exclusively Anabaptist background, so I'm
Right,
dealing with
right.
people from different places, and um, teaching all of us that we we do really, like, not in not in an esoteric way, not in an ideological way, not in like something that we would all say yes to, but is hard to do. We we really, really need the community. Like to dismantle individualism among Americans is like dismantling consumerism among Americans. Like it's so endemic to who we are as a people. It's very, very hard to deconstruct. And I think there are some tools that the church has to try to deconstruct individualism. And they're tools that we're missing in a lot of places. I think that community is one of them. Accountability is one of them. I think that the Eucharist is one of them. I think that having communion together in a real intimate way as family groups is one of the things. But like accountability, like community and accountability are associated terms to me. Living close enough with people
Mm-hmm.
that they see you outside of the regular meeting schedule is a huge part of having real accountability in your life. Because, this is something I've talked about here before, is that as a communitarian, I thought for a long time when I was younger that, what the problem with all of us is, the problem with having real relationships is hypocrisy, right?
Right.
Like people are phony. And what I've learned through my ministry is that a real hypocrite is not actually very common. People
Right.
that just like are two totally different
Right.
people
Yep.
is a very rare thing. Mercifully, because when you come across a real hypocrite, the destructive power of a real hypocrite
Mm-hmm.
is monstrous. Like it's horrendous how much damage can be done by a real hypocrite. Mercifully, most people aren't that kind of person. They don't live two entirely different lives behind closed doors and now to them. What the real problem with the church that I've learned is that it's not that when I come to the church, I put on a complete false persona. It's that I put on a curated persona. The mask of me that you are likely to see at a meeting together where we're doing church meetings together it's not a fake me. It's just the best version of me. It's not phony. It's just curated. And getting past the curated self with a group of people is a really, really hard thing to do. You have to have some kind of so what do you have to do to do that? Well, you have to have relationships that are real enough that you're willing to risk relationships, credibility, social status, reputation. Like you have to be willing to risk those things. And so, who do you risk those things with? You risk them with people that you feel really love you, or that you're really connected to, that you have real investment in one another. Those are people that I'm willing to risk my reputation and be honest with who I am. You also have to have access. Like you have to be close enough with each other. And that access works in two different ways. One of them is that there's just enough interaction, enough man hours spent in relationship that you really get to know who people are, but also enough proximity that you see me outside of my curated time, like living in co-housing or living in the same block or stopping by one another's house or being around each other's children, or especially, our kind of, not everybody here is in this scenario, but our ideal scenario is like some kind of co-housing, like where we live next to each other. Like I want to be close enough with the church. This is my like communitarian roots. I want to be close enough with my brothers and sisters in the church that that proximity alone is destructive to the American dream, that it's destructive to the idea that I'm the king of my castle and this is my domain that's all mine and nobody has any rights to come in or out unless I say so. I don't want to be the king of my castle. I want to be the member of a community. And that means for me living close enough that I'm in the yard and I'm frustrated and I come out of my house and the children left toys all over and I yell at my kids and I say, why are these children acting this way? Get down here. Why? I want to be close enough with somebody that they hear me do that, and that they come to me, and that my relationship is valuable enough to them, and they love me enough that they come to me and they say, "Hey, brother, it's a little much. Like, are you okay? Like, I heard you yelling about all this stuff. Like, is that normal? Is that how things normally are for you? Is something going on? Like, how do you think that that's a good way to deal with your children?" Like, that kind of interaction is the rarest kind of Christian interaction, and it's the most valuable. And you have to have, like, there's what I've seen in our communities is that somebody has to kind of dip their toe in that water. And normally that's through our communion times. Here's why I believe that communion is one of the essential ingredients to making the church what God wants it to be. I could talk about the mystic graces, like these things that are not natural, that are from God, like the grace of the Eucharist. And that's an important thing, and I believe in that, and it's valuable, and I'm happy to talk about it, love it. But there's something much more like earthy and common in that God has made this time, the time when we sit around the Lord's table, and he's leveraged it with damnation. If you don't come worthy to this table, you're in danger. That's what he tells us in Corinthians. This is a dangerous proposition to mess with the Lord's table in a way that's unworthy. And so God's leveraged this place. Not us, not me, not you. God leverages this time where you've got to be real. You can't fake without peril. And so because there's this external impetus to be honest and real at that place, it's a place that we can leverage our relationships with each other. We can say, hey, God expects us to be really honest here, so let's do it. And so I dip my toe in the water and I say, here's who I really am. Here's what I really struggle with. Here's the parts of me that you don't see at Sunday at meeting. Here's the parts of me that are broken. Here's the parts of me that aren't working well. Here's the parts of my relationships that I don't feel good about. And I'm willing to say it. Not just, we all know that about each other, right? But I'm willing to say it. I'm willing to say, I have this problem, pray for me. I want to be vulnerable in front of you. And the more that we do that, the more we create an environment where that's not only okay, but it becomes expected. And now we have a communion table that's really functioning. It's really creating grace in people's lives because I really know the people there. I don't know the curated people there. I know the real people there. And this is incredibly hard to do. And I haven't found many tools aside from close community and the Lord's table that do that.
So how, I mean, with that, you're talking about the Eucharist, like how do you practice that?
So this is what it looks like here. So we don't really do membership at Followers of the Way. We do communion. So you're either in communion or not. That's the mark for our people.
That's the mark of membership.
That's the mark of what people would call membership, is if you're in communion or not. And we have a process for bringing people into communion. We call it spiritual assessment. So you sit down with the church, and that process is not just like it's not just a list of ideas or doctrines that people believe in or don't believe in. It's also personal things like, do you struggle with depression, or how do you feel about how's your marriage and how's child training, and these kind of like personal questions to kind of set the stage that this is how we talk to each other in the church. This is what it means to be in communion, is to have real, frank conversations about what really our lives are like. And so we kind of curate that through the spiritual assessment. We bring people into communion. There's another track too. People come into communion through baptism, which is a little bit different of a track. It's that if you're being baptized by the church as a new convert, it's expected that you're being discipled by the church, and so that's another path to coming into communion. But so then we come into communion that way. We meet in smaller groups. We've had conflicts here in Boston, and the church has changed some over the last few years, and so we ended up in a place where we had, for us, a very large group meeting in one communion, and we didn't want to break that meeting up together, and so we experimented with. So we still meet together in one place for our public meeting, but we have broke into smaller communions, and those smaller communions rotate. And this is kind of like a couple of variables. Like, we want small enough that we can have these intimate expressions, but we also don't want to we want to be able to get around and have that with other people who are meeting. So we're kind of playing with these variables of how often do we rotate communing groups, and because we want to be with all the people that are meeting together and have that kind of experience, but we also want to have enough time together. So right now we're on a monthly rotation. So we have 3 groups of 4, and that rotates every month. So we meet
3 groups of 4 people?
4 households.
4 households.
Yeah. So 4 households. We had 12 households that were meeting together. So like we put all of our single brothers in one household. They don't actually all live in the same place, but we called that a household.
Okay.
So, and all the single sisters are a household. So we had 12 households. And so we broke into 3 groups of 4, and then we just rotate every month those pieces so that everybody kind of shares time together. So we meet, and another thing that we just recently changed, Sundays used to be a whole day affair. Like we would start at 1 and we would be done at 9. We were having a communion meal, time to have communion, and then we would have our public meeting, and then we would have a fellowship meal afterwards. And it was okay for me. I have an older family and I have older children to watch younger children, but our young families were just getting wore out. Like it was just a long, hard day. And people were starting to lose their joy in being together on Sunday. And ironically, it was actually making people less connected, in that you spend 8 hours together on Sunday, and then somebody calls you on Tuesday, and you're like, I just spent 8 hours with you on Sunday. Like, I got stuff to do Tuesday night. Like, I don't want to get together. And so people were getting together less. It was actually destructive for community. And so we modified that. We dropped our second fellowship meal. Like, we don't have a meal after our public service now. So we meet at 4:30 in the afternoon for communion. It's 2 hours. So there's 4 households together there. 2 hours. We have a meal, and then we, after we eat and we're talking fellowship, we say, okay, let's come together for communion. We quiet down and we go around, and every person shares what's spiritually significant in their lives that week. And we go around, everybody shares.
Now, is this a mixed group of adults and children?
Yeah. Yes, but the children aren't a part of communion. I mean, my children will often sit on the floor, or sometimes they'll be playing in the other room on the deck or something. There's different things happen.
So when you're talking about...
but it's the communing members are sitting around a table usually where we...
But then you're talking about an intimate conversation with the communing members. Like, my question is, like, are children present for that?
Yes, they tend to be. A couple things. I get what you're asking. Like, are they hearing people sharing temptations and struggles? Yes. Here's the thing about it. One, I think if you use the Bible as a metric, and we're reading the Bible as our children, the Bible's pretty graphic.
Right.
Like, there's plenty of things in the scriptures that are hard for children to hear, and we still teach them the scriptures. So children aren't quite as fragile and vulnerable as we would tend to think. However, that doesn't mean that there aren't times and places where some discretion is advisable to have children in the room. Communion isn't really the place to resolve the problem. It's the place to confess the problem. And so you don't need a whole lot of specificity. You need enough that we're being honest and clear about what we're saying. So if a young brother is saying, or an old brother, or a young sister, an old sister, if somebody says at the communion table, I've been struggling with lust this week, I don't need to know how many incidents and who that was with and what you were thinking. I just need to know that's frank enough. I was struggling with lust this week, and here's the context for it, and here's how I repented, and I want to make this right, and I want you all to know and pray for me. Now, it doesn't leave there. That doesn't stay there. We have small groups that meet every week also. And in the small groups is where we'll talk about, so if that brother's in my small group, I'm going to say to him, hey, you confessed that you were struggling with lust this week at the agape table. And that's the 3rd time this month that you've had that struggle. Like, what's going on? Let's figure out why this keeps happening and put the things in place in your life that you need to be walking in victory over this. So that small group is the place to work out the problem. The agape is the place to confess the problem.
Okay.
So it's not one or the other. So at the table, you don't have to share a lot of specificity, because somebody's going to ask you on Thursday when you go to your small group.
So when you're at the table, just kind of trying to visualize what this looks like. So are the adult communing or the communing members sitting around the table and you eat a meal together there, or do you eat a meal together with with you and the children at the same table.
Yeah, it's kind of like a fellowship meal, like a normal fellowship
Okay.
meal would be. Everybody's eating and sitting around there, and then we'll say, let's come together for communion, and we'll kind of like make sure that everybody's at the table.
And then you kind of separate out to it.
Yeah, and the children will
Okay.
sit in a corner and
Yeah.
color, or they'll go outside and play or something.
Right, makes sense.
And then everybody goes around and shares. And it's not that we have to confess something every week. Sometimes there's nothing to confess that week, and that's okay. That's good. Like we should, that's okay. But whatever spiritually significant about your life is the time to share that. So maybe it's a praise. Maybe God did something really sweet with me this week, and I want to tell you all about it. Or I'm struggling, or I have medical concerns, or this thing is happening in my family, or whatever the case, whatever spiritually significant gets shared at the agape table.
Are you taking turns then? Like, do you go around the circle and take
Basically
turns?
just go around the
or
room,
do
yeah.
you just open it up?
No, we because we want everyone to share.
Okay.
And so, if you open it up, then quiet people they'll wait to the end, or they'll miss their turn
The same
that week.
person will always speak.
Yeah. So we just pick somebody and we go around the room.
Okay. Yeah, that makes
And
sense.
then we use unleavened bread. Somebody made it in house. We use water mixed with wine, and we bless.
Wait a minute. You do what? Use water mixed with wine?
Yeah.
And
Pour
why?
half a glass of wine, half a glass of water.
Why?
It's a throwback to the early church. So some of the early church writers will attribute some significance to it. They'll say, Jesus' side was pierced, there flowed water and wine, and that's the Eucharist cup. That might be a little bit overly spiritualized. I think actually it's probably the case that wine for poor people in the first century is usually in the context. It was usually must, like it was like a jelly that you had to mix with water
Oh, okay.
to constitute it.
Right.
So it's probably a throwback to just being a poor church and having poor wine that you had to mix with water. But they attach some spiritual significance to it, and we just, because they did, we do, and so
That's not super significant.
No.
Okay.
But it also makes a little bit of a middle ground for people who don't love drinking wine.
Okay.
It's watered down in half, so that helps them too. So
And then
good for everybody.
And then it's just kind of the traditional, you pass the cup around.
We bless the bread, we pass it. We bless the cup, and we pass it. We have one cup. Everybody drinks from the same cup, and then we'll often depending on the groups, like sometimes we'll have a Eucharistic hymn that we use every week for a while, or
A what?
a hymn,
Oh,
a
okay.
particular hymn. Or we'll sing a song, or we'll just pray and close, and then we go to our public meeting.
And you said how many people are in that group, but I forgot.
It'd be 4 households.
Four
so
households,
if that's
so-
the singles, though, if that's the single men, that's 2, 4, 6, probably 12 adults.
Okay. So approximately 12 adults per or between 8
Between 8 and 12, yeah.
8 and 12 per communion group.
Yeah. And that's probably about the right number for that kind of communion.
Yeah. Okay. And you said that you kick the children out to color or to go out on the deck.
They'll often sit at my feet too. Like if we're in a room around a circle instead of at a table, I'll often have. I think as a father, I think it's good for the children to hear and see I feel like it's kind of the birthright of church children to see the Eucharist and to see what happens and to get some of that kind of like some of the just that sense of the Spirit of God working among his people is something that to grow up in that environment, I think is good. It's good for them to see and hear people, the saints of God, being honest and sincere and open, and to feel the Spirit of the Lord in that place, I think it's a good place for a child to be. I think it's kind of a part of the birthright.
So with the way you're doing this now, having a meal beforehand, then you're having communion together, and then you're going to the public service.
Yeah.
How do you manage visitors?
Well, they would come to our public meeting, and then, so this is something that I've been really glad for here is that we really don't think of our meetings evangelistically. Like they're really not evangelistic events. Our evangelism is being done at cafes and our supper tables. It's not, the meeting place isn't really for that. It's primarily for us. It's the assembly of the saints. And so there are certainly people that visit from time to time, and it's good to have people visit. I'm not opposed to it all, but we don't do much planning around that. Like people, because until recently we were meeting in homes anyhow, and so unless you had a direct invite, you wouldn't even know where to meet the church, and so it's just not a visitor heavy event.
But I mean, I don't know how Boston compares to State College as far as visitors wise, but we run almost every Sunday. I'm not going to say every Sunday, but almost every Sunday we have some type of visiting family, whether it be visiting other Anabaptists visiting or non-Mennonites visiting, or somebody is visiting. So we've really wrestled with how do we have communion every Sunday without being a kind of exclusive, like, okay, we're going to go have communion over here and you guys can just hang tight until we're back.
Well, that's why we've done it before. But so just tell people our public meeting is at 7. You're welcome to come. So communion's already done by the time anybody would show up at our public meeting.
That works great. But then what about the meal? Like most of the time we're having these people, they're coming in from maybe a distance and maybe staying with one of us.
Right.
And then
that second fellowship meal is what we cut out for the good of the church. And so that public meeting now, our only meeting on Sunday, our public meeting is at 7:00 at night. We don't have a morning meeting. This is another thing I love about the church in Boston. I always hated going to a meeting with a bunch of little children at 10:00 in the morning. It's crazy.
Why?
Because why get everybody up and rush out the door and be all crazy? I guess maybe we're more night owls here than some other places, but just making a Sunday morning chaos. Like everybody's got to run around and find your shoes and get dressed and get out the house and get out, go. Like I just hated that. I never liked it. And so now, like my Sunday mornings are beautiful. They're bliss. We drink coffee, we roll around the floor, play with children, read a book, get ready. If I'm preaching, I do my sermon preparation Sunday mornings. It's lovely.
You have a lot of students come through from Sattler.
Mm-hmm.
How do they and most of them come from Sunday morning churches.
Yeah.
So do they have any reaction to the Sunday evening service?
I haven't heard a lot from the single people. A lot of our families really appreciate it. When we met earlier in the afternoon, we would have agape at 1. It was hard for some of the families that would do naps for the little children around that time. And it was also hard with food. But now that we've adjusted, we meet at 4:30 for our agape meal, and that's right about supper time. And so it actually syncs up a lot better. Mm-hmm. So we don't have a fellowship meal for guests, but we're meeting at 7. So you should have eaten already by the time you come. And if you're staying with one of our families, then you just go home. And if we want to stick around and have coffee and drink coffee till 9 or 10 o'clock at night, the people could, but it's just not expected that anybody has to stay after the public meeting.
So you have visitors at your house, and they're there for Sunday for the day.
Mm-hmm.
Do you just not attend agape?
It depends. Sometimes if it's close family or something and they wouldn't be at our agape table, we would tell the church, hey, we're not going to be there. We have family in town and we're going to go do something with us.
And they would just eat with you and you would just go to the main service.
Show for the main service. But we don't have a specifically closed communion. We have a close communion. So people can come to our communion that are not in our local church. We typically, so those people, we call it a sojourner's provision, like from the Passover, if somebody's traveling through, you're supposed to take care of them. So we have sojourners in our communion from time to time. The expectation is that they have their own home somewhere else, that they're connected to a body somewhere that we would consider faithful in some way, and that they're known by somebody in the church in an intimate enough way that they can vouch that they're, we're not saying, do you believe everything exactly the same as Father's way, but you're known by somebody of us to be a faithful brother or sister in Christ. Right. And so we invite you to our table for that Sunday. Here's where that gets interesting, though, is that you could come through here. Like I could invite you to be a sojourner here. I would probably invite you to be a sojourner here, to come and have communion with us. But if you moved here, then I would say, hey, brother, you need to go through spiritual assessment before you join communion.
We have that same dilemma as we don't have closed communion, but then, what if somebody, so we've kind of done a thing, I forget exactly what the details are, but I think it's like you can have communion twice before we
want to sit down and talk.
Yeah.
Yeah.
which now that we've also moved to weekly communion, it makes it more difficult to, I mean, like twice comes around really quick.
Yeah.
We were doing monthly,
Right.
so
Right.
you could be in the community for 2 months
Uh-huh.
before we start thinking about the next step. So now it's 2 weeks. But
We just say if you live here, you need to go through spiritual assessment to
Okay.
be in communion. If you're traveling, somebody could come through every year and have communion with us. We wouldn't
Okay.
care. But if you're going to move here, if you live here, if this is your home, then you need to connect to the church.
yeah, makes sense.
How has it been switching to weekly communion for you all?
So it's really interesting. We did a 2-month experiment. We said, okay, we had all church meeting. We have an all church meeting every month, and we said we're going to have at one all church meeting. We said let's try it because it was a lot of hesitation around it, mostly around logistics, not
Right.
not necessarily around the Eucharist itself, but
Right.
around logistics. And we said, well, let's try it until our next all members meeting, which happened to be skipping a month, so it was 2 months. And we got to that meeting, and nobody really. We had a bunch of other important stuff to discuss, and we didn't really get to that question, and nobody cared that we didn't get there.
Mm-hmm.
And then, I think 3 months in, we had the next meeting, and we talked about it again, and we said, "Hey, do we need to keep bringing this up at meetings?" And everybody's like, "No, we don't need to bring it up again. We're good with it." So we're there by accident, I
That's
guess.
great. It's good.
And it's been good. We don't do it quite the same, but there are a couple details. One of them is having a larger group. We're not that big, but we have around 10 households, I think. Maybe 11. I guess it would, if you count all the singles, we'd have 11 or 12 maybe. But that makes our group a little bit bigger.
Yeah.
And I feel like somehow we don't have quite the intimacy that we would need to make it really, I don't know what you call it, really close. But like for a long time I felt like our Sundays should be centered around the Eucharist, not around
Preaching
or
Amen.
some other thing. Like if
Yeah.
it's not around the Eucharist, it doesn't really matter.
Right.
I shouldn't say it doesn't matter at all, but like that is the central thing,
Right.
and it should stay the central thing.
Yeah, amen.
So I've been really happy to see it happen. It's not perfect. We'll probably tweak it, but I'm really happy to see it
That's
happen.
great.
I think
Glad to hear that.
I like to see that we're headed that direction. But there has been a question, especially we've been kind of wrestling with, like the children. When you live in close community, what do you do with children? Like, when you're really close community, you have lots of children that grow up together, that they know each other well, way better than I did in my community growing up. Like, I got together, Sundays and Wednesday nights, we saw each other, and we were allowed to talk a little bit. We all sat separate. So, the boys talked a little bit over here, the girls talked a little bit over here, and we didn't see each other.
Yeah.
But when you have a community where you have, lots of boys and girls, and everybody's mixed, and lots of free time to talk to each other, like, I guess the first question is that something that we should deal with? Or is that something we should care about a lot? Or is that something that works itself out? Like,
Yeah, probably some of all the above. I think it is I think supervision is an important thing with children. I think it's good for children to be monitored and in earshot and eyeshot, generally. I kind of feel both ways. Like I want to be instilling the values of my children that I don't need to be over their shoulder. Like, I think that there's a way of raising children that's very kind of like image forward. That's like, well, it's, you better not do this, that, or the other thing, or make us look bad. Like, that's one way of producing that. I don't think it's a healthy way, but actually imparting our values in our children, why things matter to us the way that they do. so that they have the ability to know what I would think is right or not, and do that whether I'm watching or not is obviously the goal we want to get to. But it takes a lot of supervision in between. And the other thing I would say is that even if I'm not directly supervising my children, there's not a meeting that we have that on the car ride home I'm not saying, who did you talk to and how did that go, and do you think that's a good thing to be talking about, and what did he say, and like I ask my children about the interactions they're having. That's a very normal conversation that we have after a meeting, and I use that as opportunities to say, well, that's not really a good way to talk, is it, and what do you think about that? And so we're using those as teaching opportunities. And when I see, and when I see my children doing something that's too rowdy or unkind or maybe picking on somebody or getting involved in whatever little things happen with children, those are also opportunities. Being present and watching and having at least the corner of your eye knowing what's happening with your little ones is an important skill for a father to develop, and a mother. Mothers tend to do it more instinctively,
Yeah.
I think, sometimes than fathers do, but it's a good skill to have, and to just have them in the corner of your eye. And I think too, the organic low church way that we do church, we can miss out on some of the trend. It's the same with homeschooling, right? Like, there's a lot of opportunities that we have in homeschooling, but we fall short in some places. We don't test well. We don't sit in desks well. We don't do schedules well. Those are things that are worth shoring up if you're a homeschooler. Like, test your kids, teach them how to take a test, teach them how to sit still, teach them how to have a deadline, because those are things that aren't necessary in a homeschool that can be missed. And it's the same with churches that are home friendly, is that you can miss out on teaching children to sit still and teaching them to be comfortable around mom and dad and staying close. And those are worth shoring up and making sure that we're doing well. And it's a part of being, I think, a good family for the church's sake and for our own sakes, that we're not troublemakers, we're not making problems, we're not always the loud ones, we're not making a mess when we go in somebody's house. Like, all of those are things that we should be teaching our children to do. And so from time to time, to just say, hey, it's communion. I know everybody's playing over there in coloring or playing with blocks or whatever. I want you to come sit here. And for the next, till we're done with communion, for the next 40 minutes, we're just going to sit here. That's a good thing to do. It's not always necessary. We don't do it all the time, but it's good to be able to do.
So on occasion,
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
just
And I think there's another thing too, is that if you're in a church like ours, and there's going to be a couple hours where children are sitting, like, just having some crayon or bringing a pack with you. A lot of times my children, if we're going to be in a long meeting, the children have a backpack and they've got a notebook and a couple cards to play with and some crayons and some things to keep themselves occupied, or a baby doll for the girls, that there's some things for them to do. So when I say, hey, come sit over here, they're not just like twiddling their thumbs. I don't expect that of them. I don't think that's a good thing to expect.
So teenage boys,
Yeah.
you have some. What, any tips on raising healthy teenage boys in the city?
Yeah.
Or what's the, yeah.
So there's a couple of different things in that domain. I think one is like, what do they do? I think we have some advantages being in Boston. Boston's a very green place. I used to live here on Oakland Street, and the Charles River, the Mystic River, is 3 blocks that way, and the Fells is a 500-acre wilderness area that's a few blocks that way. Boston is a very green city.
Okay.
It's why it's such an expensive city. There's a lot of natural resources here. So my boys had kayaks, and they would, on a summer afternoon, take their kayaks down here behind City Hall and go into the Mystic River and paddle for the day, or they'd go take their bikes up to the Fells and go walk around on the trails. That's, not every city has those things, but
Right.
we did here, and we happened to take advantage of those things. It was good for them, but we would do those same things as a family too, not just as the boys. I put my boys, I put to work fairly early. They started working with me about the time they're 15. New England's pretty sensitive to child labor laws, which is good. I'm glad that children were protected from the Industrial Revolution. But I was careful about it to do things in an above board way, that they were covered under insurance and had work permits and all that. We did everything right so that it was okay for them to be with me. And we restricted what they did and didn't do according to laws so that there wasn't any problems. They're Italian boys, so they grow beards early, so that helped. The other set of questions, though, is like, how do you deal with temptation, and how do you deal with a world that's hostile to Christianity? And I think that's both in ideology and worldview ways, and in temptation. In ideology, as I think as a father, I've always had this idea that the truth is never afraid of honest inquiry. So I've never seen ignorance as the way to bring my children up in the faith. I'm not afraid of having conversations about questions and ideas that are different than our own. And I think that living in a diverse place and knowing people that have different values and different ways of living is something that I have taken as an advantage, not a disadvantage. We talk about what do Muslims believe, and why do they believe that? How does their value system work? Why do some people not believe in God? These are conversations that I have with all my children, not just my boys, from the time they're little on up. I mean, the other thing is like gender and sexual issues. Like, you know, we all live around homosexual people. Pride parade events are just happened. You know, I remember one of the first years we were here, my young teenage children walked through Boston Commons when the Pride Parade was coming through. Like, it's here. But there again, for me, that doesn't pose a particular problem because when my children were young, we used to go hold gospel signs outside of the porn shops. Yeah. My oldest son, when he was 5, asked what he wanted to do for his birthday. He said he wanted to go to the porn shop because he wanted to that's where we would go hold scripture signs. And so I haven't ever taken the view that shutting the world out and closing the blinds is the way to teach your children how to live faithful. I've always said I want to be the one to narrate the world to my children. And that, I think, is the best description I can give of a father. A father is the narrator of a child's world. Like, you think of David Attenborough on a nature documentary. See how the little seal flaps its whatever and is communicating to the mother. That's what I want to be in my children's life. I want to describe what they're seeing and experiencing in the world from God's perspective through my voice to their lives. I want to be the one. So when we go to the porn shop and my little children say, what are we doing here? This is a place where people come to commit iniquity. They commit sexual sins, and they look at people immodestly, and they indulge in their flesh. They're going to figure out that that's in the world. All of our sons are going to figure out that that's in the world. Who are they going to figure it out from? I want them to figure it out from me, because I can tell them why people do that and why it's wrong and what the bad things that happen from it are. That's what I want. I can't dictate how they're going to make decisions, but I can put my voice in their head and in their heart to where when they encounter those things, they know what they're seeing and they know how I think about it and hopefully how God thinks about it, so that they have a real chance to encounter whatever they're going to encounter in the world with those perspectives behind them. And it's not like none of my children have failed or have not succumbed to temptations. They've struggled with sin just like I have, and my wife has, and everybody does. So it's not, I don't think curating a sterile enough environment where I can make sure that they aren't exposed to anything that's outside of my worldview until they're 18 or 20 years old. I don't think that's a healthy developmental technique. I want to be there, and I want to be together, and I want to talk to them openly about what they're seeing and why they're seeing it, so that they have a perspective from our worldview
that helps them find their way through those things. And that's true with ideologies. It's true with temptations and sin. It's true with good things and bad things. That's my view.
Yeah. Well, Matthew Millioni, it's been a pleasure.
Glad to have you, brother.
Just so much wisdom.
Thank you. God's taught us a lot. He's been very, very good to us, very faithful.
Thank you for listening. If you find value in these conversations, please share them with others. Now go set the world on fire.